Hello and welcome to this episode of Theology Still Matters. My name is William Hemsworth. I want to thank you all for joining me on the show today. And tonight's topic is something that maybe you haven't heard a whole lot about, but it is something that's very important. And it's the role of the ancient city of Babylon's, basically their influence on the writing of the Old Testament. So when the word Babylon is said in today's culture, there's normally one of two reactions. The first reaction is one of not caring because it doesn't immediately affect our lives. Now, when asking about Babylon over the past few weeks, this has actually been the predominant answer. And the second reaction given was to describe the recent past that have shaped political and in some cases economic policy of not only the United States but of the world. So many questions were asked to get these reactions. Questions such as, is Babylon relevant today? What was its role in the development of the Old Testament? Is it relevant that they were mentioned throughout the whole Old Testament? What effect did they have on the ancient Jewish people? Now, in most, and there were some exceptions, but in most cases, the laity of the church, so the everyday church goer, seemed very ignorant of the significant contribution that Babylon's existence had in Old Testament history. As theologian W. Brueggemann states, in biblical history, Babylon's chief significance is as a mighty empire that God used in the early 6th century BC as his agent for punishing his people for their stubborn and grievous covenantal disobedience and disloyalty, taking the residents of Judah and Jerusalem into exile. Now, the purpose of tonight's show is to explore some biblical passages to elaborate not only the history of Babylon, but its effect on the writing of the Old Testament. So we're going to look at some historical and extra-biblical documents to detail that information. And in the course of doing this research, it became very evident that Babylon had a very significant effect on the Jewish people and subsequently the writing of the sacred text of the Old Testament. So let's look at a little bit of a history of Babylon. And it's going to help us gain perspective on what the world was like at the time. So Babylon was the most famous city in Mesopotamia, and the ruins of the city lie in Iraq, about 59 miles southwest of Baghdad. Now, in the old Akkadian language, Babylon meant city of the gods, and was founded between 2334 and 2279 BC. Now, when it was founded, it was simply known as a large port town along the Euphrates River, but it was also very close to the Tigris River, and this area of the world would become known as the Fertile Crescent, and they were smack dab in the middle of it. Now, very little is known about Babylon until 1792 BC, when King Hammurabi took power. Now, King Hammurabi enlarged and heightened the walls of the city, engaged in great public works which included opulent temples and canals, and made diplomacy an integral part of his administration. Now, he was so successful in doing this that in both diplomacy and war, that by 1755 BC he had united all of Mesopotamia under the rule of Babylon. And at that time, Babylon was the largest city in the world, and Hammurabi named his realm Babylonia. Now, when Hammurabi died, the empire shrank in size and was sacked by the Hittites in 1595 BC. Under the reign of the Assyrian ruler Sennacherib, who reigned from 705 to 681 BC, Babylon revolted. Now, at this point in history, Babylon was known as the bastion of learning and culture. In 604 BC, Nebuchadnezzar II, who we read of in Scripture, took over as emperor of the empire. He built some of the most beautiful structures in all of Mesopotamia. Now, the exile of the Jews and the construction of the Hanging Gardens also happened under his watch. And in 539 BC, the Persians, who were led by Cyrus the Great, who is also mentioned in the Old Testament, invaded Babylon. They held Babylon in great regard and made it the administration capital of the Persian Empire. Now, in 331 BC, the Persian Empire fell to a young general named Alexander the Great. Maybe you heard of him. Before his death, Alexander the Great ordered the superstructure of Babylon's ziggurat pulled down in order that it might be rebuilt with greater splendor. But he never lived to see his project to completion, and over the centuries, its scattered bricks have been picked up by peasants to fulfill other dreams. All that is left of the fabled Tower of Babel is the bed of a swampy pond. And in 141 BC, the Parthian Empire took over, and Babylon was forgotten about and fell into ruin. Now, Babylon is mentioned very early in Scripture, and in fact, the first mention of the city and its significance to the people of Israel is in Genesis 10, verses 8 and 10. Now, those verses say, Cush was the father of Nimrod, who came to be a mighty warrior on the earth. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Erech, Akkad, Calneh, and Shinar. Now, this chapter in Genesis is known as the Table of Nations, and this verse in particular traces the genealogy of Noah's son Ham. The name Nimrod literally means "we shall rebel." Now, if that is the case, he lives up to his name perfectly in regard to his relationships with the Lord and with the Jewish people as a whole. Now, the great Bible commentator Matthew Henry writes, Nimrod's aspiring mind could not rest. He was resolved to lord it over his neighbors. Now, from its founder, Nimrod, we find the spirit of the great city of Babylon. One that was blessed with natural resources because of its location in the Fertile Crescent. But they were not happy with what they had and always wanted more. The Jewish historian Josephus has this to say about Nimrod. Now it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man, and of great strength of hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God, as if it were through his means they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured this happiness. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence upon his own power. There are some scholars who suggest that Nimrod was the Gilgamesh in the Gilgamesh epic. This epic was an ancient document that also spoke of a worldwide flood, but it was also significant for Gilgamesh starting the first God is dead movement. If this is the case, then Babylon and the Jewish people were absolutely bound to clash, and according to the epic, Gilgamesh sets out to kill the person responsible for sending the flood upon the earth. So let's shift gears a little bit and look at the Tower of Babel. And the Tower of Babel is found in Genesis chapter 11. It describes a people of the same language who are building a monument that will reach the heavens so they can make a name for themselves. Genesis 11, 1-4 states, Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we can make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the earth. Now this story has great significance, not only in Scripture, but in world history. And according to the Concise Bible Dictionary, Babel is also the Hebrew word for Babylon. And according to Scripture, the founder of Babylon was Nimrod, which we already discussed, who was the descendant of Noah's son Ham. On that, we can assume that this occurred after the flood. The flood happened so the earth could have somewhat of a fresh start with evil people being eliminated. The people gathered and decided to build Babylon and erect a tower to show how great they are. Not only that, but they want to build it to the heavens. Now maybe this is where Babylon received the name City of the Gods. And the King James Version Biblical Commentary states in regards to this, quote, This is the cultural focus of mounting human arrogance. The tower could be a fortress. Parallels to the account of the building of Babylon and its temple tower suggest that it was a prototype ziggurat or temple mound, found first in classical form in the early 3rd millennium BC. Now the Tower of Babel is a prelude of things to come in the Old Testament. It shows the pride of a nation who sees themselves as superior to those around them. The Tower of Babel, though it is a literal event, is also a symbol of rebellion. At the center of every sin is an I. The people had the attitude that they were better and they always wanted to show it. They grew in power and would eventually overtake the Israelites. That's also the spiritual message of the story. The writer of Genesis knew that and incorporated it so future generations would know the dangers of pride and arrogance. The church historian John Collins writes, thematically, the story of the tower provides an apt conclusion to this phase of history, as it reiterates the theme of human limitation and the dangers involved in trying to be like God or rise to the heavens. Now, perhaps the greatest example of Babylon's influence on the Old Testament could be seen in the exile of the Jewish people to Babylon. Now, because of the Israelites' disobedience to God, He allowed them to be conquered by Babylon. They were exiled for a period of 70 years, and then they were allowed to return back to their land. There's arguably no king in the history of Babylon as powerful as Nebuchadnezzar II. Under his rule, the Babylonians defeated the Assyrians and the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II. The Babylonian military under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar II defeated their Egyptian foes, and that allowed them to take over all the Assyrian lands, which included Israel. Now, the events of this takeover of Israel and Judah are recorded in 2 Kings chapter 24. And 2 Kings chapter 24 verse 1 states, during Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the land, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. But then he changed his mind and rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. Now, as previously stated, Babylon defeated Egypt to acquire the territory, which included Judah. And for 3 years, Judah lived under Babylon. But then they rebelled, and Babylon came into the land by force. In a strange twist of fate, Babylon had become a means by which God disciplined his people for their disobedience. They were taken from their land, plundered, and the temple was destroyed in 587 BC. And the Babylonian Chronicle records, Year 7, month of Kislevu, the king of Akkad moved his army into Hadeland, laid siege to the city of Judah, and the king took the city on the 2nd day of the month of Aduru. He appointed in it a new king to his liking, took heavy booty from it, and brought it to Babylon. Scripture has a similar recording in 2 Kings 25, 9-10, which says, He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the commander of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. The Lord used a foreign land, who did not even believe in him, as a divine instrument to help prepare their hearts for the future Messiah. Throughout the Old Testament, we read stories of the people's disobedience, but through it all, God was faithful. Throughout the Old Testament, we read of the Lord saying how he was going to discipline his people. In Isaiah, he named some, such as Cyrus by name. This event had a huge impact on the writing and style of the Old Testament. Books such as Jeremiah, Lamentations, and Daniel were heavily influenced by the events that would take place during the 70 years of exile. In Jeremiah, we read of God still loving the people and will be giving them yet another chance. The Lord goes on to say that they will be his people in Jeremiah 32:38. After 70 years, the people were permitted to return to their land, but many did not. Church historian J. Julius Scott writes in regards to that, quote, we know only little about the captivity. The Hebrews spent the period of captivity in scattered locations. Their experiences were diverse. Many never returned to the land of Israel. In fact, from this time forward, the majority of Hebrews, at every point in history, have lived in the dispersion or diaspora, that is, outside the boundaries of the land of Israel. The time of the Lord's judgment will come. It's not a matter of if, but of when. And the people of Israel and Judah never thought they would see the day in which their sins would reap punishment. As previously stated, the heathen Babylonians were chosen to carry out this deed. And this was prefaced as far back as Genesis and is mentioned throughout a majority of Old Testament texts. Some very important people came out of all this exile, and some you may have heard of them. The Old Testament prophets Daniel and Ezekiel both performed their ministry in Babylon. They were involved in the exile and subsequently deported from Judah. It was Daniel who became a leader and loyal servant to the empire, but he maintained his faith in the Lord. In Daniel chapter 2, Daniel comes to the aid of King Nebuchadnezzar and assists him in interpreting a dream. Daniel 2:24 states, quote, "Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and said to them, 'Do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret the dream for him.'" Now this was a very dangerous move for Daniel to make, because if he was wrong about the dream, then he would be executed. Daniel was being a witness and thought of the needs of others. Yes, he was loyal to the king, but he wanted to save the lives of the wise men even more. Now the dream that Daniel would interpret for the king was one that predicted the end of the Babylonian Empire. The fall to the Persian Empire was further documented by Daniel in chapter 5 of his book. The fall of Babylon is also written about by Isaiah in Isaiah 46, 1-2. Now Isaiah specifically names the Persian king Cyrus who will conquer Babylon, which is the way the Lord chose to judge Babylon for its sins against his people. In conclusion, guys, Scripture in Babylon is mentioned in Scripture from Genesis all the way to the book of Revelation. When the Lord needed to discipline his people, he chose the Babylonians to give it. However, God was merciful and only let the exile last 70 years. The Lord also promised to punish it, as Jeremiah 25 verse 12 states, quote, "But when the 70 years are fulfilled, I will punish the king of Babylon and his nation, the land of the Babylonians for their guilt, declares the Lord, and I will make it desolate forever." Though it seems like those that are doing wrong have the upper hand, that's simply not the case. Through Babylon, we learn that evil will always be punished. New Testament scholar William LeSueur writes, Daniel's concern over the 70 years of Jeremiah's prophecy is interpreted in terms of both the restoration of Jerusalem and also the time of the appointed prince. The story of Babylon helped the Old Testament writers better speak of the faithfulness of God, the punishment of evil, and the coming of the Messiah. Babylon was a huge empire that seemed indestructible, but Daniel told the king that it was not so. Through the characters in the Old Testament, the love and mercy of God were spoken to Gentile nations. Guys, I hope this has been some help to you. My name is William Hemsworth, and thank you for tuning in to this episode of Theology Still Matters. God bless you guys.